Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bible by the Week. We are in week 5, and congratulations. If you've gotten this far, you are 1/10 of the way through the Bible. And when we last left our heroes, we had Joseph, who had become the number 2 person in Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh, and his brothers, who had sold him into slavery, which was how he ended up in Egypt, had come to Egypt to buy food from Joseph, not knowing that that was actually Joseph because he looked like any other Egyptian, and they assumed that he was dead, and he didn't speak their language. He had an interpreter speak to them. So Joseph had sent them back home with the food, but he also had kept one of the brothers, Simeon, as collateral and told them that they had to bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, who had stayed home with them. Now, this put them in a conundrum because their father, having lost Joseph, the oldest son of his favorite wife, now would not let go of Benjamin, the younger brother. However, they were starving. They ran through the food that they had bought in Egypt, and they had to go back to buy food. And so Judah, the oldest brother, insisted that he would be collateral. That is, that if anything happened to Benjamin, that the father could take him and his whole family. And so finally, Israel agrees to let Benjamin go to Egypt with all of his brothers. They get to Egypt, and again, Joseph plays the part of the second in command to Pharaoh. They don't recognize him. He gives a big feast for the brothers, and he gives twice as much food to his full brother Benjamin, which is a little bit suspicious. And then when they are on the way back to, that is, when his brothers are on their way back to Canaan, Joseph has one of his officials hide his royal cup in the bag of grain that belonged to Benjamin. And this, of course, the officials, stop the caravan and say, "We're missing this cup." And they say, "Well, none of us took it. Here, you can search our bags." And they search the bags and they find it in Benjamin's bag. And they say, "The rest of you can go, but we're taking him and going to imprison him, possibly kill him." And so Judah, sure enough, volunteers to take the punishment for Benjamin. And they all get traipsed back into Egypt. And what happens is that Joseph finally breaks down and tells his brothers who he is and weeps at seeing them. And they are reconciled. And he invites them to come live in Egypt because this famine is an extended thing to bring their father and the whole household. And so Israel, his father, and the whole household, they move to Egypt. And they tell the Pharaoh that they are sheep herders because the Egyptians consider that kind of a dirty, low-grade profession. They aren't big on shepherds. So they give the Israelites the land of Goshen, this land that is rich, fertile on the other side of the Nile, give them their own land there. Israel blesses the Pharaoh. And during this time, this extended famine, remember it's going to be 7 years, Joseph collects money from all the people in Egypt and other lands for the food that they've stored up. And then when they don't have money, he collects livestock to enrich the Pharaoh. And then when they run out of livestock, he takes land from the Egyptians. Now you can imagine this does not make him particularly popular among the Egyptians. It's a good deal for Joseph and his family. It's not a good deal for his fellow Egyptians. And so this is kind of where we're left when finally Israel dies. And after Israel dies, their father, the brothers are all afraid that the only reason Joseph's been nice to them is that the father was still alive. And now that their father's dead, he's going to kill them all and take his revenge. And so they make up this lie that Israel, in his dying breaths had told the brothers to tell Joseph, not to do anything to them. And Joseph, again, breaks down in tears because he legitimately has forgiven his brothers. And the book of Genesis really ends with this wonderful statement of faith by Joseph. He says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." And then the end of the book ends with Joseph having taken the bones of his father, well, his father was mummified, to be buried in Canaan along with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and also Leah, that Joseph asks that someday his bones be taken to Canaan. And that's the way Genesis ends. It ends on this upbeat note. Everything is all fine and dandy. And then we start reading into Exodus. And when we start Exodus, we discovered that the Israelites have had many descendants. Remember, this was part of the first part of the promise given to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, was that they would have many descendants. And sure enough, they're having lots of descendants. But eventually, a new Pharaoh comes into power. Some historians believe it was a new Pharaoh, a new family of pharaohs, actually. And he, quote, doesn't know about Joseph, probably willfully, but, he has no respect for Joseph or the promises that were made by previous pharaohs. And also remember, the Egyptians probably hated the Hebrews that were among them, and so they enslave the Hebrews. And yet the Hebrews are still prospering. They're still having lots of children, and this becomes a national security threat. And so the Pharaoh gives a command that all of the Hebrew baby boys should be killed, because of course it's a patriarchal system, and that's how power and so on is going to be transferred down through generations. And the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, refuse to do that. And when Pharaoh asks why, they say, "Oh, the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're very vigorous. They give birth before we can get there." By the way, a couple of words to look for that I've noted in Exodus is very often you'll see the words heard, as in God heard them, God remembered them, God saw them, God knew them. And this is very intentional. It's not that God forgets about us in that he has a lapse in memory, but the word that gets translated remembered is God brings to mind, right? Or God acts on what he knows. And this is what happens after what turns out to be about 400 years of slavery. God, quote, remembers his people. That is, he chooses to act on their slavery. And so we have this situation where the Hebrews are continuing to multiply. The Pharaoh has, not satisfied with killing off the baby boys. He's continuing to try to go after the Hebrews and stop this population explosion. And there are two Levites, a man and a woman, who have a baby boy, and they hide him as long as they can in their house. But the child's going to get bigger and it's going to get louder. And so eventually they pray to God, and they don't know what to do, but they put him in a basket that floats in the Nile. And they assign the older sister, Miriam, to watch and see what happens to their child. And what happens is that it so happens one of Pharaoh's daughters is down bathing in the Nile with her attendants, and she hears the baby crying, and she sends one of her attendants who draws out of the water this basket, and there's a baby boy. And the Pharaoh's daughter, apparently not having a child of her own at this point, she has pity, adores this little baby boy, and she takes him home to the palace. But of course, she needs somebody as a nursemaid, someone to nurse the child. And so Miriam, who's been watching, says, "I know a woman who's given birth. She can be the nurse," and goes and gets the child's mother. And that child is named Moses, or Moshe. It's related to the phrase draws out, because Pharaoh's daughter drew him out of the water. So she brings home this little basket case, Moses. He's raised in the palace. Eventually, he learns that he is actually one of the Hebrews who are enslaved, and this must be working on him. We don't know the whole story. There are movies that have tried to make this up, but he eventually one day sees a slave driver beating a couple of Hebrew slaves, and he just gets enraged. He realizes these are his people. It could have been him, and so he kills the slave driver. And this is not a godly thing, but Moses doesn't really know God at this point. He's been raised with the Egyptian gods. And the next day, a couple of those slaves are fighting with each other, and he tells them to cut it out. And they say, "What, are you going to kill us like you killed the slave driver?" And so he knows that the gig's up, and he has to flee Egypt. Turns out he flees to the land of Midian. He finds a beautiful girl there drawing water from a well for her flocks, or trying to, and he comes to her rescue and helps water the sheep. She takes him home to dad. whose name is Jethro, and he's a priest of Midian. Now, not necessarily a priest in the line, of course, of what's going to come later, a priest of Israel, but he's a priest of Midian. He has wisdom, and he invites Moses to join his family. Moses marries one of his daughters, Zipporah, and becomes a shepherd. Now that's kind of act two of a three-act play, because Moses is 40 years old when he leaves Egypt, and he spends the next 40 years in the desert, where he has a couple of children with Zipporah, and then one day he's out herding the sheep up on a mountainside when he sees this strange sight. He sees this bush that's burning, but it's not consumed, and he goes to check it out, and God speaks to him out of the burning bush. And God tells him that he is going to be sent back to Egypt to talk the Pharaoh into letting this tremendous free workforce, all the Hebrew slaves, go to freedom. And Moses is not actually receptive to that idea. He doesn't really want this assignment. And so notice all the excuses that Moses have. We have, chapters full of this. He's up on Mount Horeb, and he says, well, if I go to the Hebrews, who do I say sent me? Because he doesn't really know the true God. And very significantly, God says, I am who I am. That's significant, but the sacred name for God in the scriptures is Yahweh. It is the Hebrew verb that's the be verb. It's the verb that, in a sense, means I am. The sense is that there are all these false gods out there. This is the God who really is, the God who exists. And you'll find this in Jesus. That's why when he says, I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life, and I am the good shepherd, this is going to resonate through the rest of scriptures. He's identifying himself with the true God. So Moses says, okay, that's your name, but he says, they're not going to believe me. And so God says, well, what's in your hand? In other words, what do you have to work with? It might not seem like an asset, but God, Moses says, well, I got this staff, and God shows him he can turn it into a snake and turn it back again. And he takes Moses' hand. He says, put it in your cloak. And he puts it in his cloak, appropriately enough, bandaged hand. And it comes out leprous, which would be a horrible thing. And then he puts it back in his cloak, and it's not. And God says, here's a couple signs. Not only that, but, we'll do some other things. We'll turn the water into blood and so on. And still Moses isn't convinced. And so he says, well, I don't talk so good. There's some belief that Moses had some type of speech impediment, and God says, I'll give you the words, don't worry. And Moses says, send somebody else, please. And God gets mad, but he tells Moses he's going to send Moses' brother, Aaron. Apparently he has a younger brother who's going to be his spokesman. And so they set off for Egypt. Now, interesting story along the way, Zipporah, God is going to kill Moses because he hasn't circumcised his sons. Why hasn't he circumcised his sons? Well, because that would be a clear sign that they were Hebrew. And Moses still doesn't trust God that this is going to turn out well. So he hasn't circumcised his sons. And therefore God, because Moses won't trust him, is going to strike him down. But this becomes known to him. And Zipporah, who's not even Hebrew, she circumcises the sons, saving Moses and their sons' lives from God's wrath. And she says, surely you're a bridegroom of blood to me, which, we don't know exactly the full force of that, but it seems pretty forceful. So, of course, Moses goes back, and famously he gets to speak to the Pharaoh, and he shows him the sign of turning the staff into a snake and back. But Moses has these magicians, think tricksters, kind of like magicians nowadays. They're illusionists, right? They don't actually have magic, but they know how to pull off some things. And they do a similar thing. They turn a staff into a snake. And, of course, Moses' snake swallows up their snake. He turns his hand leprous. They're able to replicate that. And then Moses does a devastating thing, because the Egyptians, of course, they worship the Nile. The Nile is what floods every year and provides irrigation for their crops. And Moses, or God through Moses turns the water of the Nile into blood. And there's no way the magicians can replicate that sign. It's not like a parlor trick. It's something major. But still, Pharaoh doesn't want to let them go. And so, and I do want to point out that these signs, it's thought, are actually affronts to the Egyptian gods, kind of adding insult to injury. So, for example, the Nile, Hapi is the god of the Nile in the Egyptian pantheon, and so turning the Nile into blood is an affront to him. And after this comes a plague of frogs, which you might remember that one of the Egyptian gods, Het, is the frog god, and there are some others that we're not sure, but might well be a direct attack on the fake Egyptian gods. So we have one plague after another. After the frogs, God sends gnats. And each time Pharaoh seems to relent and says, okay, take away the plague. You'll get what you want. Because what Moses has asked is that the Hebrew people be allowed to go out into the desert to observe a festival, to worship their God, which they will do. But Pharaoh suspects that that's not all they're going to do. He doesn't think that they're going to come back. And so every time that one of these plagues is withdrawn, the Pharaoh hardens his heart, and he doesn't relent, and he won't keep his word. He won't let the Hebrews go because, again, this is a major part of their economy. They need all of this slave labor because otherwise, who's going to do the work? What, Egyptians? You can't expect them to do this kind of work. And even the suggestion that Moses had come, and when the Hebrews were listening to Moses, Pharaoh punished the slaves. Instead of them making bricks out of clay and straw, Moses said, okay, you have to make just as many bricks, but you have to find your own straw. And so the Hebrews, it works pretty well to undermine the Hebrews' confidence in Moses. They don't much care for this whole thing. They certainly don't trust him. But nonetheless, Moses continues to represent God in working for the freedom of his own people. So we get the plague of gnats, and Pharaoh reneges on that, and flies, and then Pharaoh warns that Moses warns that if Pharaoh doesn't relent, that he's going to kill all the livestock, but doesn't work, and so all the cattle out in the field, die. This is a huge loss of not just meat but wealth. This is how wealth was measured in many ways in a kind of agrarian herding society. But Pharaoh hardens his heart. So God sends boils, physical affliction. And, think of Job and what he went through. You would think this would change the Pharaoh's mind. The Pharaoh, relents, and then God removes the boils, and the Pharaoh hardens his heart. Then God sends hail. It's not only wiping out the livestock, but now the crops are going to be destroyed by this hail. And Pharaoh relents. God, saves them from the hail, but and by then, the Egyptians. This doesn't affect, oddly enough, where the Hebrews live, but Pharaoh hardens his heart again, and then God sends locusts. If there's anything left from the hail of their crops, the locusts are going to completely wipe it out. Pharaoh relents. God removes them. Pharaoh refuses. So we go through this cycle after cycle. Finally, God sends darkness. Now, you probably know that one of the greatest of the Egyptian gods was the sun god, Ra, right? So again, this is a direct challenge to the Egyptian gods. And Pharaoh relents. He says, okay, you can go out in the desert, but don't take your livestock. Well, of course, they need to take their livestock because they actually aren't planning to come back. But Pharaoh refuses to let him go. He threatens Moses. He says, I don't ever want to see you again. Moses says, hey, you asked for it. And God has Moses announce one more plague. Now, here we have kind of a parenthetical, a section, because the final plague is going to be the death of the firstborn. And, so much in the ancient world was geared around fertility, about having a future generation to take care of you, always looking towards the next generation. And to not have that was considered a curse. And just as with the Hebrew people, for the Egyptians, the firstborn was the one that would inherit the head, the leadership of the family. So this was a terrible threat. And God tells Moses to tell the people that this is going to be the final plague. And so they need to get ready. They need to pack their bags. God actually gives them some special things that they are to do. They are to slaughter a spotless lamb for each family, and they are going to roast the lamb with herbs, and they are going to prepare unleavened bread, that is bread with no yeast in it. Why? Because it travels better. It doesn't, spoil as quickly. You can compact it and so on. And they are to take the blood of the spotless lamb and they are to smear it around the doorposts of their house, because the angel of death is going to come and he's going to pass over the houses of those who have a spotless lamb spread on their doorpost. Now, for us Christians, of course, this all of a sudden gives so much meaning to, for example, John the Baptist identifying Jesus by saying, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," or Jesus being crucified when, during the Passover, Jesus being described throughout the New Testament as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, the one who was slain for us so that death will pass over us. And God tells the people that they are to have an annual ritual called the Passover as part of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where every year they remember this liberation that God is going to do. So they never forget that the true God is the God who liberates them from slavery. He doesn't enslave them, which is how some people think of the true God now. He actually liberates us from slavery. So God gives them this ritual, tells them, about the future. They're gonna be this, and at midnight, death strikes all the firstborn of Egypt, but passes over the Hebrew doors. And so Pharaoh sends the Hebrews away, and the Egyptians are so anxious to get rid of the Hebrews after this. After these terrible plagues, that God tells them, go ask your Egyptian neighbors, hey, you got any money with you? We need travel money. You got any jewels? You got it? And the Egyptians say, take it, just get out of town. And in that way, it fulfills a prediction that God had made, that the Hebrews will actually plunder the Egyptians. Even though they're slaves, they've been enslaved for 400 years, they have no force of arms, God arranges it so that they do actually plunder the Egyptians. So that's where we leave it for this week. We leave them on the cusp of departing Egypt. And it's a really interesting section because it starts really with Joseph establishing the family of Israel and it growing into a nation and reconciling with them. And then this week's section ends with God liberating the Israelites. But of course, their journey has just begun. And so we will get a chance to read about that this coming week. I hope that you are enjoying your readings. Again, congratulations. You're a tenth of the way through. And the Lord be with you as you study his word.